Welcome to the Healthy Brain Podcast, episode 3, with my guest James Walsham. Walsham? Is that
Walsham.
Walsham, there you go. We got there at the end. So, just explain to the viewers, maybe just give an introduction about yourself and where you're currently at, man.
Yeah, so I am an online coach for hypertrophy and health outcomes. So that's sort of my main thing, my main focus. I actually did my undergraduate degree in podiatry, so completely unrelated. Podiatry is sort of effectively, it's like a lower limb specialist. People very like foot focused, because if you look at the feet, basically it's the first place you're gonna see things like diabetes, neuropathy, diseases that like generally lifestyle diseases. A lot of them will start at the foot. And that's kind of halfway through studying that degree, I was sort of like, okay, hypertrophy seems to combat basically every one of these diseases. And obviously it's a lot more nuanced than that. But I sort of realized how useful hypertrophy was as a mechanism for health. And now my goal, I basically run this company called Hypertrophy Hub, where I do my online coaching through, but also we create information. I'm writing some articles and lecture series for a few other companies. And in those sort of things, I'm basically trying to show how useful hypertrophy is as a mechanism for health, but then also how people can achieve it better and better, and trying to how you can generally sort of achieve hypertrophy over time, and continue to progress over time without injuring yourself, as that can often be a something that can a thing that can sort of stop people in their tracks relatively
100%. 100%. And maybe did you want to just explain to the viewers what hypertrophy actually is and like what the process is behind it, so how it works?
Yeah, so defining hypertrophy is relatively straightforward. So there's a few different kinds of hypertrophy, but the main one we're thinking about is sort of hypertrophy of the muscle fiber. So you have the total muscle, and then that's broken down into different segments. And then if you just think about the muscle fiber, there's a bunch of muscle fibers which will make up a particular muscle. This is every muscle in the body. And then basically the way you can cause muscle hypertrophy is you basically have to cause hypertrophy of the individual muscle fiber. There is also sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. However, I don't think it's currently too relevant to the discussion. That's basically hypertrophy of everything except of everything except the muscle fiber. So the other cells within the musculature. But it's very it's less useful. I think it's more likely useful to focus on hypertrophy of the muscle fiber. But basically what that means for the viewer is like, you just want to increase the size of muscles. That's basically what hypertrophy means. Hypertrophy is just the scientific term. I like the word hypertrophy because it simplifies it. For instance, if someone says, it definitely complicates it if you don't know what hypertrophy means, but basically hypertrophy makes it so you don't have to say muscle. If you say muscle growth or muscle size gain or whatever, size gain is sort of relatively straightforward, but muscle growth could mean a range of different adaptations. Like it could mean neuromuscular adaptations or just general strength increase. That's sort of, I think, where there's a little bit of people sort of misinterpret sometimes what that means. And hypertrophy means it's just for muscle size increase. And that's what I think is one of the most useful adaptations for health, and obviously hypertrophy in itself.
That makes that makes complete sense. It's pretty much saying that just the increase, obviously, in the muscle size within a specific goal. So it's just the muscle enlarging, getting bigger, and like you said, it can mean different things. So like it's very brief. It's very brief if you're saying just muscle gain, because like you said, it could be like you said, neurological can't speak English today, adaptations, and it can get a bit confusing within that. So and what's pretty much got you into fitness? Like, what's the journey behind that? Have you just always had a passion for health and fitness, or is it just something that you?
So your question cut out a little bit there. What was the?
Oh, sorry, mate. So just pretty much what brought you to the health and fitness industry, man?
So in terms of, it's mainly sort of, I was halfway through studying podiatry, and I just realized how basically 90% of the problems in health, or, I completely pulled that number out of my ass, but a massive percentage of the problems in health, I would say So you might be even looking at like 95%. Like there's no number to like pull out here, but it's like a crazy amount of the problems in health are due to lifestyle factors, meaning like someone smokes or they have bad nutrition or they don't exercise enough. And then a range of other things like stress, sleep, etc. 90, I would say a large amount of the problems are caused by poor lifestyle. And then poor lifestyle isn't really that many things. The two golden sort of the massive nuggets in that is nutrition and fitness. People don't exercise really that much at all, or a lot of the population doesn't. And when they do, it doesn't really induce any adaptation, and the general human is becoming more and more unfit over time. So that's generally what I would say is the thing that's causing this sort of tidal wave of health problems that we're kind of facing. Like it's pretty dire. Like for instance, you look at obesity. It's like obesity is a very complex one, and it's very multifaceted, and you cannot have a simplistic sort of solution to it. It's a problem that's been caused by basically technology and society progressing in other ways. But it's very difficult to pin down a solution to that. And as a podiatrist, I was sort of looking at it and I was like, wow, as a podiatrist, I didn't get to do anything. You as a podiatrist, you see someone, for instance, someone with diabetes, they've got type 2 diabetes and then they're sort of way down the line. You don't see anyone in pre-diabetes, or you barely ever do. And if you do, you don't get a part in solving it. And you shouldn't as a podiatrist, because you don't have the scope of practice. You don't have any nutritional knowledge, or the knowledge you do have is, I would say, for the most part, quite incorrect, or at least the places that I was taught. And your knowledge of exercise prescription is very little as well, and I think it's way out of your wheelhouse, and that's completely fine. Podiatrists do a fantastic job at other things, but I sort of realized, basically in health, it needs to be preventative. You cannot take it eight stops down the train track. It's like you need to sort of start at stop one. When are they going to actually progress to these conditions that will end someone's life? Like diabetes sort of is this thing that people don't know a lot about, and it's something I'm very passionate about, because diabetes is not just like this, oh, it'll kind of make your quality of life worse and you might die a little earlier or something. It's like it will make you go blind if you get diabetes. It'll cause this thing called retinopathy. It'll also cause dying in your feet. They'll die in your foot first before anything else. And then also, for instance, someone will have their foot amputated because they basically, a wound will not heal, for instance, and then they'll just have to have it amputated. And yeah, it's a terrible disease, and among many other lifestyle diseases, you end up with similar kind of outcomes. And it's tragic to me that all of these can be produced, the large majority of these can be reduced through appropriate lifestyle interventions, meaning exercise and nutrition for the most part. And that's why I was kind of like, okay, that seems like a more important area for me to focus on.
So it was pretty much your calling, and you just decided pretty much to make that difference. And what you've described, it's pretty serious. That's fantastic, man. And that pretty much ties into the next question about to ask. It's pretty much to do with like why fitness enthusiasts or anyone training for a specific fitness goal, no matter if it's muscle gain or hypertrophy or strength goals, CrossFit, you name it, why there's that dependent on motivation, and why people do lose motivation at the end, if that makes sense.
Right. So do you mean by at the end, do you mean sort of like, what do you mean by that?
So pretty much like these individuals or clientele, they depend on motivation to get them going.
Yeah. Right,
and why you don't have that self-driven thought process to just go in there, get it done, and tackle your fitness goals in a sustainable manner. Like why?
Right.
Because I see that day in, day out. Sometimes even at my gym, it happens. So it's kind of like people they're just spinning their wheels.
No, exactly. And, I think like if you, like, one of my sort of mentors and someone who has taught me a lot outlined, Eric Helms, like he basically outlined the muscle and strength pyramids. It's right. It's like,
mate, I preach that all the time.
Yeah, like you cannot do anything if you don't have adherence. It's like that's the pillar of it. And he's very correct with it. Let's say there's like one or two exceptions where it's like adherence isn't at the bottom of the pyramid, but for the most part, it's like really you cannot get anywhere without adherence. But it's the thing. It's not the clientele's fault that they aren't adherent. It's the trainer's fault. And yes, there is definitely clients where we cannot make them adhere, but you kind of have to think, okay, what can I do to produce buy-in with this client? What can I do? As an online trainer or an online coach, you kind of realize very quickly that if you don't have adherence, if they're not tracking the data in the spreadsheet, basically as an online coach, you work primarily just through data. You have their weight, their calories, blah, 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 a range of other data. And without that, you are blind. You cannot do your job. You can only go off subjective.
Cool.
If you don't have the quantitative data, you have to take the qualitative. And basically, if you can't achieve adherence, you cannot achieve anything. But it's like you have to realize as the coach why or how, what's basically making them not adhere. And you can go through with it. You can achieve that in a variety of ways. I'd say it's definitely one area that I'm still trying to learn a lot more about. But it's like you kind of have to figure out what is the thing that's stopping them from adhering. Is it just the rigidity of the thing that you have prescribed? Have you prescribed a nutritional exercise protocol that is much too rigid for them? Is it much too flexible? Do they feel as though it's not going to work? Do they have buy-in? Do they believe in you as a coach? Have you demonstrated your knowledge? Like, for instance, sometimes with online clients, if I sense that they don't trust me enough as a coach or they don't trust my knowledge, I think, how can I prove to them that I do know what I'm talking about? How can I prove to them? One thing that I really like to do is I like to really encourage with my clients, like, you can ask me any question you like at any point. I'm never, ever going to get critical. I'm never, ever going to get offended. I'm never, ever going to wonder why you're asking me that question. I want my clients to ask me questions, and I think every coach should do that. Because if they can't question your methods, then how can they know that you are not just basically pulling it out your ass? You have to have some kind of rationale behind what you do. And I find that's something that for me has been really beneficial in helping buy-in, but it's definitely a individual problem. Like, you have to figure out what with your client is the thing that's stopping them adhering. It's definitely a multifaceted problem. And I think a lot of people will blame their client for not being adherent, or they'll make jokes about it, or they'll post memes on their story about clients not being adherent. And I think that's downright it's like, there's definitely things that clients are doing that are making them not adhere by themselves. Now, there's things that are out of your control, but with any of this, it's like, as a coach, if you're focusing on things that are outside of your locus of control, or the things that you can control, then you're not doing your job right. It's like you can control a certain amount of variables. What can you do to control those? What can you do to make them more adherent? Like, some of my clients don't want to do a weekly video check-in, and that's fine, but then I had to figure out what will they be willing to do. And then that's how we make progress. And these clients still progress. It's just like, one of my clients is doing his thesis. It's like he's already got so much on the table. Am I really going to say, okay, you need to track steps, you need to track this, blah, 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 all these other things that are really just minutia? It's like, focus on the things that really matter, move from there, get them to adhere to things, and like, give them a result. Like, if they're not adhering because they don't think the process works, like, figure out what you can do to show them how they can achieve the goal, or make them achieve the goal, even trick them in some ways into achieving the goal. Like, for instance, if you have, if a client has never, the other day on Hypertrophy Hub, it's like, if a client has never trained before, they haven't trained that with that high volume, over the first 6 weeks or so, you're not going to actually achieve much muscle hypertrophy. The fiber is not actually going to increase in size. But what might occur is, basically, as you introduce more volume, or more total number of sets of exercises, you're going to get more intramuscular swelling. So the muscles are basically going to be more swollen, and then the appearance of hypertrophy is quite prominent there. It might be important to note to them, like, hey, look at this. And depending on the client, you might want to be like, yeah, cool, look at all the progress we made. But with another client who's more sort of, they really focus on the evidence and they know a lot about this stuff, you might explain to them, hey, this is the setup cost. We've just done the setup cost. Now is where we can cash in. This is where hypertrophy occurs. So maybe that would be something important to outline with them, to sort of, you kind of have to think about what the client wants and what kind of person they are. But it's definitely something I'm still trying to learn, and something that it's probably my biggest weakness, I would say, as a coach, would be achieving adherence.
100%. And it's interesting you touch on, I think it was the second last point about the first 6 weeks, it's pretty much getting the form correct and all that. And I think a lot of coaches, other coaches, what they do is they say, oh, yeah, you're going to get results in 12 weeks. And then the first 6 weeks, they're like, nothing's happening. And I think people just get, or clients just get impatient and they pull the pin. Whereas I think the coach needs to educate it more in a way where it's like, this is a phase. This is what's going to happen. Don't expect the results immediately. Be patient instead of just doing a propaganda where there's 12 weeks, you are going to look jacked, you know, AF or whatever.
I 100% agree. Like,
have a beach body or whatever. It's just, it's not realistic. So
no, I 100% agree. It's like you have to kind of demonstrate to them and like just say like, this is the setup cost. Like, it's necessary. There's no other way to achieve hypertrophy without doing this.
Yeah.
Like, you're probably going to achieve some if you're a beginner. Like, you'll probably achieve some hypertrophy. There's little evidence to show that you do, but like, you know, like even intramuscular swelling, that looks like hypertrophy. So it's like, that's fine, but also educate them being like, this is where long-term changes happen. It's definitely something that I think is people either lie about it or they don't understand it. Or coaches, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. No, I definitely agree with that, mate. And that pretty much ties into the next question, which is periodization in any training program. So what I've said is it a necessary application? Do we need it? And what's your thoughts on it? Like, is it a necessary plan of attack in the training program, or can we get away with not having it?
Right. So I would say, in general, we'd probably want to define periodization first. So periodization effectively is you're adjusting variables over time. So the best way, you kind of have to define a few terms before we can explain periodization. So periodization is adjusting variables over time. For instance, adjusting intensity or relative intensity, or something we would call sort of, you could nearly look at that as weight on the bar. So adjusting weight on the bar, either adjusting the amount of reps you're doing or you're adjusting the sets you're doing. So some of the variables like that, or like the RIR or the reps in reserve you're doing every week, that would be something that you might change over time. So then you would be periodizing that over time. So some kind of time phrases we would use, or time span phrases we would use in sort of sports science or hypertrophy sort of hypertrophy science is not a thing, but you know, in sort of sports science, you would have you generally have your microcycle, which is generally like a week. It can be different, but generally you're looking at something like a week in hypertrophy training. That's for the most part how you would term it. You would call it about a week long span of basically maybe you might have push, pull, upper, lower, whatever. That would be your microcycle, and then every time that repeats would again be push, pull, upper, lower, whatever your split is or whatever. And then from there generally you have a mesocycle after that. So a mesocycle is a bigger period of that. So it's kind of like a 6-week cycle or 8 weeks or 4 weeks, depending on how long you go for. That depends on a lot of factors. So a mesocycle is made up of 4 to 6 or 8 different microcycles. And effectively, the whole concept of periodization is what you do over that mesocycle. What variables do you choose to change? And this is something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, because there's a lot of different approaches. And inherently, when we make any kind of training program, as an evidence-based practitioner, you are jumping ahead of the evidence, and that's okay. It's okay to jump ahead of the evidence, but it's like to change different variables, we're basically changing variables to achieve progressive overload. And to achieve progressive overload, we have to change, basically, you have a rep range. So you have, like, let's say, for example, just in an ideal world, every exercise, let's say, is from 8 to 15 sets, let's just say. And then let's say that doesn't change. Basically, whenever you can, you add a rep. Let's completely ignore reps in reserve or RPE. Let's completely ignore that. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that everyone's going to failure every set. Let's say you work your way, you start 1 set on each exercise, just for simplicity. Up to 15 reps over, let's say, 3 weeks in a given exercise. And then you have to decide, what do you do when you get to the 15 reps on that set? Do you add another set, or do you add some weight? And generally, I would say there's a little bit of a disagreement between different sort of schools of thought. And obviously, the way I've explained it is leaving a lot of nuance out. So, like periodization and programming it's very advanced for some individuals. Like I don't think everyone should be doing like laying out their mesocycle and all that. Like it would be nice if they would, but in the reality is what we're doing there is you'll have a 6-week mesocycle or whatever, and then you'll deload for a week. And one of my friends, Aaron Hoey from JPS, he's sort of someone I've discussed a lot of this with. He originally sort of recently made this idea clear to me. Like you don't need to have everyone deload. Like for instance, if you have a mum who's 30 years old, or however old mums are, 45, whatever. And
varies these days.
yeah, and you don't have to have them deload, because in reality, the only reason we do a deload is basically to basically drop fatigue. And if they're not accumulating enough fatigue, then it's fine. And yeah, that's the only reason we actually have a deload, is like to end your mesocycle, drop fatigue. But if they never get to the point where they're reaching what we would call MRV, however, you could basically call it MRV, meaning maximum recoverable volume, but basically they're so fatigued that they cannot adapt any further. That likely wouldn't happen in a general population, or sort of your more sort of casual trainees, and that's absolutely fine. But it's more you might be better off in a population like that. One, we have to think about adherence. So what keeps them adherent? But then we also have to think about kind of, okay, with that trainee, what kind of things can we do to achieve hypertrophy with them, if hypertrophy is the goal? I would argue that you should try and keep quite a few exercises the same week to week if you can. So for instance, a lot of personal trainers will have someone come in and they'll basically just fuck them up. They'll just be like, okay, we're going to make you do all this shit. You're going to be so sore. You're going to be fucked. And that's okay. Like that potentially has a place. But it's not going to achieve hypertrophy. And maybe it's useful to explain this to your client. Like think about the 30 to 45 minutes you have with them, or however long, and then think about how can you educate them around these things. We basically, for hypertrophy training, we want to get pretty far away from novelty, meaning we don't want to be rotating exercises every week. But for instance, say if we had a leg press and then a squat, you could have Monday you leg press, Thursdays you do a squat, and then next Monday you leg press, and then up within those exercises. But generally, we don't want to. That might be the base level of sort of. That wouldn't. I don't know if you would even call that periodization. It's just exercise selection. You would keep exercise selection the same, and then you would scale it up from there on how advanced the training is. If someone's been training for 6 years and they're not making any progress, they're going to failure all the time, and they just haven't made progress in years, that's when you would really want to introduce something like periodization. You really want to then think about, okay, if someone's just been hammering themselves for years and years and years and they haven't made progress, the first thing I'd probably do is, one, make them take a deload. Then I'd probably put them into like a strength phase, or like a primer phase, what we might call it. I think the coin was termed by Steve Hall from Revive Stronger. That would be a good idea. And then you would sort of go into a typical sort of 6-week or 8-week or 4-week, however, which sort of methodology you come from. And there's a bunch of different methodologies that do argue quite a lot, but I think you need to understand their arguments. You need to understand how the variables work. So there's a lot of base understanding that needs to occur before someone applies something like that. But it's sort of like you can pick, like, lock down exercise selection, and then figure out, like, okay, don't change shit up every week. And then from there, it's like, because realizing exercise selection isn't that important. It's like, you're not going to do magic from that, right? But it's like, then figure out, like, how much with this person can you change the variables? If they're an absolute robot, then potentially you'd want to train them like Steve Hall trains, or like Mike Chattel trains. That might be a good idea. But say someone like myself, I think I need since I've got, I don't know if I mentioned this at all, I have scoliosis, so I have like a spine issue that basically causes a lot of chronic joint issues. And with that, it's a lot of auto-regulation, or like changing things on the fly based on how I feel. Okay. So that is two different, completely different demographics. If someone's ready to give up a lot of, or be very, very rigid in their training, then periodization and all that is a very, very good idea. But also, like, understanding periodization is realizing that changing anything over time technically is periodization, but the typical like mesocycle structure with week one is not as hard as week six, or week six generally has more volume or volume load. That kind of structure, I would say, is not for everyone. But it depends. Like, if someone's relatively serious about this, it's probably the best idea. In some form, shape or form, you want to increase volume load. So what we would call volume load is basically weight times sets times rep.
Yeah.
To week six, you would want volume load to increase. But that can be done in a variety of ways, whether that's increasing reps in general, increasing weight on the bar, or just increasing the number of hard sets you're doing. That's generally like the way to increase volume load. And basically everyone should be increasing volume load over time. So that's kind of the most basic level of periodization is get stronger over a variety of rep ranges and exercises over time. That would be kind of the bare minimum you would need to achieve. Well, not necessarily need to achieve hypertrophy, but yeah.
Yeah, no, and in touching that, mate, would you suggest, like with the big compound movements, such as if, just say, on a Monday, I've got a heavy day, like a heavy-ish day while I'm doing my squats, my deadlift variations and all that. Would you suggest, like when you say with periodization, would that apply more for those exercises where it's preached that you don't really want to train to failure on those exercises due to causing a lot of fatigue? Because I noticed, like, when I'm doing Romanian deadlifts, if I went to an RPE 9, or if I left like one in the tank or went to failure, my hammies are still sore from like to Friday. It's crazy. I don't know if I'm the only one like that, but I've got a lot of DOMs when it comes to that, and it's pretty much the same volume. It's just the intensity's just ramped up. So would you advise on those movements maybe to steer a bit, keep a few in the tank, or would you say that periodization doesn't matter in those exercises, or maybe isolation exercises, it matters less than compounds?
Yeah, so in terms of that, I would say generally for compound exercises, like you said, the RDL, it is very common that people will get like just an intense amount of DOMs from something like that.
Thank God.
RDL, like it's definitely very common. And I would say with those, like for instance, all my clients, I start them at 3 to 4 reps in reserve at the start of the mesocycle, so quite far from failure. Generally 3 to 4 reps in reserve, that is still shown to induce hypertrophy. As long as novelty and all that has been dealt with sort of in the previous weeks. So generally I would start them at a 3 to 4, but then I would progress them it depends on the exercise. If it was a deadlift, there's I don't think ever I would program going to failure on a deadlift. On an RDL, neither. I never really want to hit failure. There's nothing magical about failure. It's the closer and closer you get to failure, it's just the higher level of motor unit recruitment. It's like that doesn't actually do anything magical. It's just it basically needs to be adequate. But for instance, something that I think is not as common is among the people who will buy into reps in reserve and sort of buy into submaximal training in general, or leaving some reps in the tank, that those people, it's less common that people will. This for me is JPS basically released some content talking about how in isolation exercises in general it might be a better idea to go closer to failure, because why do we use reps in reserve in general? In general, we use it to mitigate fatigue, so we don't just shit on ourselves, basically. But in a bicep curl, how often is someone really taking it so far that it's just causing an abundance of fatigue? Definitely, I wouldn't say you should just go to failure every week on exercises like that. But for instance, like a bicep curl or a lateral raise, especially like a unilateral bicep curl, it's just like the amount of damage that's causing is quite minor. It's not that disruptive. So comparing that to like an RDL, you really want to, I would say, keep relatively far from failure at the start and then go closer to failure as time goes on, and just be careful with it. Like you'd be careful with that exercise because it's very disruptive, causes a lot of muscle damage. Muscle damage, I don't know if we've explained, but the muscle damage does not lead to hypertrophy. It's a mechanism of hypertrophy that we don't think actually does anything or very little to cause hypertrophy. And you compare it to like an isolation. An isolation is just like it's not going to do anything really. It's very rare that that's going to seriously fatigue you unless you're seriously rinsing it compared to what you've done in the weeks prior. But yeah.
Yeah. No, that sums it up quite well. And also pretty much just say someone's got an injury like yourself. Obviously, you suffer from scoliosis. How would you deal with that in terms of exercise selection? So, what exercises can you get away with? Just say the main goal is pretty much gaining, like building muscle and hypertrophy. How would you mitigate all those work around those injuries, and what exercises possibly would you do or sub out, or how would you deal with that?
Yeah, so generally, so you'd want to first of all, so for myself as a podiatrist, generally there's a few structures that I would feel comfortable thinking around and sort of all that. But as for instance, if you think about something like the shoulder joint, it's very complex structure. It's one of the most complex structures in the body, if not the most, maybe the hip or the neck or something. But it's very, I would be skeptical trying to program around that if we were continuing to cause pain. Pain science is something that I think is a very prominent topic right now, but we definitely need to be careful. The people, I think, misinterpret a lot of the conversation around pain science to say, oh, pain doesn't matter. But that's not what they're saying. They're saying you need to be mindful that pain, if chronic, is potentially psychological, or there's a biopsychosocial element of it, or sort of a biological, a social element, and a psychological element. And through your training, that's definitely something that can happen. For instance, if it's a tendonitis, so a tendonitis is generally, and it's a very hard term to define, and I wouldn't even feel comfortable defining it, but it's generally kind of a load related problem. A tendon basically cannot handle the volume or the intensity of a certain exercise that it's had acutely. And then basically what you do is you build up its tolerance to load or its tolerance to handle load. Like a tricep tendonitis or a tricep tendonitis is a relatively simple thing to sort of combat. But it's like, if you haven't had formal training in it, I wouldn't try and solve the problem. I definitely recommend they see a medical practitioner. Like, there's a variety of good people online. If anyone wants to find a good physio online, Clinical Athlete does some great practitioners. I think they do online consultations with anyone across the world. So they're fantastic. That's the main company I know of. Yeah. But I would be careful as an online coach, but also realize that if the exercise isn't causing you too much pain, you're probably fine to program around it. But it's like, if you're getting pain every single rep, that's an issue. Like, if you were doing an exercise and all of a sudden you got a sharp pain in your quads, and then you continue to just leg press, you say, okay, well, we that happened on squats, well, now we're just going to leg press instead, and they're still getting that pain, or they're getting a pain in the hip every time they do a leg press, I would be very careful there. You definitely want to see a medical practitioner there. It's sort of, yeah, but if they just have a niggle at the end of or sort of a little achy pain that wasn't caused by like a sudden sort of sharp injury or sharp feeling event, it was just something that came on a little bit, it feels a little bit bad, and it's near the end of their mesocycle, for instance, where they've got a lot of fatigue, you potentially might be okay. Just, okay, call the deload there, or just basically, if you're nearing the end. I noticed basically with clients, this is something actually I'm implementing with my coaching, is in some shape or form, you should track those sort of things. So if they have a niggle that does tend to come up, when do they start getting it? Do they get it in the 4th week, the 5th week? And then that can be a pretty good measure, a pretty good proxy for fatigue. But it's not like you really want to push that. You don't want to push those niggles, because that's when you get quite severe injuries. Although I may be speaking out of my scope of practice there a little bit. There's definitely some better people to... Like, injuries are such a complex topic. There was recently a debate on, I think it was Omar Isuf's channel, with Mike Israetel and Jordan from Barbell Medicine, and I think Michael from Barbell Medicine, who I've previously interviewed, and it was a very good discussion. But injuries are very complex, and there's a lot of disagreement among injuries. But definitely, be skeptical, but also don't sort of just say, okay, do nothing, because if it's certain kind of injury.
Yeah, no, that helps a lot with defining injuries, because I find that some people do, like you said at the start, do change up the exercise because they're like, oh, I'm feeling a sudden niggle or something that's not as serious as what you described, but only to realise that they're in week 6 and the end of the block and there's a lot of fatigue, and they're like, this is too hard. Well, next Mesa, I'm gonna opt for like a leg press, and then they just see him do a bunch of isolation exercises because of comfort. It's like, no, that's different. That's a different story altogether. So that pretty much clears a lot of things up. And also in time with that, there is a lot of, I don't know if it's more of a debate, but there's a lot of opinions on this with hypertrophy. Obviously the big 3 movements, do they have a place in hypertrophy, and are they, like, just say I program bench press, right? Is that in a lower rep range? Is that going to produce more hypertrophy? Whereas if I'm just doing incline or flat dumbbell press in 8 to 12 rep range, because sometimes a lot of people say, oh, you're building strength, therefore it's involving a lot of muscle groups, and it's still going to contribute to muscle. Now, some people say it's not the case, whereas other people prefer it. So is it a matter of just preference, or is it good to implement one of the big 3 movements, and do we need them in a hypertrophy-based program?
Right. So in terms of the big 3, I would say you can separate, like, you can take the deadlift and you can put that in a different category, because I think it's a whole other thing. I'll touch on that in a second. But for the squat and the bench press, no, I would say there's absolutely nothing special about them. I'd say for a lot of people they're suboptimal, but for a lot of people they are definitely optimal. And that depends on, for the most part, how good it feels. Like, exercise selection is pretty far up the pyramid of how useful it is. Like, main thing is, are you achieving 3 to 4 reps in reserve? Like a true 3 to 4 reps in reserve. Are you achieving that at a bare minimum? You can even go for 1 to 2 and just stay at 1 to 2 reps in reserve across the board, and that's probably a pretty good approach as well. And then, are you achieving that within a sort of given rep range? Pretty much the rep range for hypertrophy is anywhere from 5 reps to 30. So it's like you're looking at a massive rep range, so you can work anywhere within there, anywhere within 3 to 4 reps in reserve, and at the higher rep ranges, maybe 1 to 2 reps in reserve. But there's no inherent difference, because your shoulder joint does not know if it's adducting or it's sort of moving towards the midline due to a dumbbell or due to a barbell. And there is an argument, why do we not just use a machine or a barbell bench press? Like, I would say inherently there's nothing magical about any single exercise. There's just exercises that feel better or worse for a certain person. Like, I haven't barbell squatted and barbell bench pressed pretty much ever, like, at all, really. Like, I've done it like periodically, and the only reason I've done barbell bench press is basically to achieve just strength. I just thought it was fun. Like, I basically did it for strength, for a laugh. Like, I thought it was fun. And it didn't really it's never really achieved much hypertrophy for me at all, really. And squats, I've literally never squatted. Like, I've probably done like 10 sets of hard squats in my life total, something like that. Like, it just feels absolutely terrible for me. And there's no reason to do it. There's nothing special about the hip flexing in a squat versus the hip flexing in a leg press. Like, I'm a massive fan of the leg press for hypertrophy. I think it's fantastic, because if done correctly and you get a large amount of range of motion, like some good examples of range of motion on the leg press would, one, like, go look at my Instagram. You can see some videos of me, or you look at, like, what's this guy? Charlton Banks. He's got the most ridiculous leg press range of motion, and his leg press is somewhat comparable to his squat. So comparing that squat and a leg press, you're really not looking at that much different. Like, you might look at sort of the torso angle or how sort of how far the trunk is generally flexed compared to the hips. That may change somewhat, but a lot of that also is you're just looking at, okay, how far back can you get your leg press? What sort of different things can you change to make the leg press give you more range of motion? And there's I've done a whole post on that. A lot of other people have as well. There's a lot of things you can do to improve range of motion and things like a leg press, because I think people just think it's bad, but it's still an exercise where you need to think about form, and it's something you need to work on form. Like, people know that you need to learn how to squat and learn how to squat properly, but with a leg press, they just think, okay, you just jump in a leg press and you sit there. But in reality, it's like, you need to, okay, how far back should you flex your lower back? Should you focus on actually tensing your erectors? Should you focus on pulling yourself into the seat? I would say yes. How far down is it safe to go? How far down do you feel safe going? Should you band the leg press? Should you not band the leg press? There's a variety of different things you can do. Should you wear lifting shoes? On a leg press, I would say a large amount of, most people should on a leg press. It's just really, really useful. But it's not commonly something that's talked about that much. But it's like, there's nothing special about a leg press. There's nothing special about a hack squat. There's nothing special about, like, comparing a flat bench press to a incline bench press. There probably is a difference there. Like, you're mainly looking at sort of the angle that you're pressing. That may change some things in terms of what's being activated. But the deadlift is something that is it's something that's quite unique for hypertrophy, because there's nothing quite like the deadlift for the erectors. The erectors and the traps seem to be very well developed through deadlifts, very anecdotally. But I don't know if it's something that's inherently special about the deadlift, or if we just don't know how to program appropriately to give the same amount of mechanical tension to the traps and the erectors through something that isn't the deadlift. Like, it's definitely, because we know that the deadlift will cause a lot of muscle damage, so it'll give you a lot of DOMs and a lot of sort of micro tears of the muscle when you do a deadlift, and sort of things like the traps and the erectors, and that is important to note. But that's not, from what we know, that doesn't drive hypertrophy. So then it's interesting to think about why a deadlift could cause effectively quite good trap hypertrophy. But I think it's definitely something to think more about, and something that I wish I knew more about, but I just don't know if there's a substitute for deadlifts. But I would basically never program them for hypertrophy. It's just they give you a unique look. I just don't think, like, they're not good for hamstring hypertrophy. They're not that good for glute hypertrophy. They're not good for quad hypertrophy. They're okay, like, they work, like, but it's like, if you want glute hypertrophy, you should probably squat and hip thrust. If you want quad hypertrophy, you should probably leg press, leg extension, blah, blah, etc. If you want lat thickness, it's like, you wouldn't go to there's no reason you should go to a deadlift to get thick lats. It's like, they're just, it's not where it happens. You need to take the lat through a full range of motion, give it as much mechanical tension as you can. It's just maybe the deadlift puts so much mechanical tension through something like the traps, and then the erectors, it's so hard to load the erectors with enough mechanical tension to make them grow. So maybe there's something unique about the deadlift, but it's just something that I don't, the amount of fatigue that a deadlift generates, like, I want to be clear, like, the amount of the fatigue a deadlift generates is not usually worth it. Like, it's like, if you seriously just care about erector and trap hypertrophy, deadlifts are probably a pretty good idea in your program, like a pretty good staple exercise. But it's like, there's a range of ways to achieve trap hypertrophy, but it's I don't think a deadlift has a massive place in a hypertrophy program. Like, I don't have it in any of my clients' programs, but an RDL, like a Romanian deadlift, is fantastic for a variety of reasons. Like, it causes a lot of muscle damage, but it's like, you're taking things through a pretty large range of motion. It's just a generally, I'd say, a better, I guess you would use the term stimulus to fatigue ratio in that sort of idea, but it's to Mike many times, and he's very, very smart, but it's important for people to realize that's a concept and it's a theory. And me and Mike have talked about this on my podcast. That is a concept and a theory that people need to understand, that it's individual. It's you can't just say this exercise is better stimulus than that exercise, and also realize that it is a theory. Like, a theory is inherently a jump from the evidence. But yeah, that's sort of my take on the general all that sort of stuff around those three exercises. But I think it's definitely, like, evidence-based culture, we kind of often understand that they're not special. But in a lot of other bodybuilding cultures, it's like they're put on a pedestal, and it's just, I think, they shouldn't be put on a pedestal for any reason, really. There's nothing magical about them except maybe the deadlift, but it's just not that useful. It just generates so much fatigue that it's just such a drain to someone's program. Like, it just takes away so much from a lot of other areas. So I'm not sure if it's useful. Although, like, I don't know if you know AJ Morris, like, he's someone who uses the deadlifts very well for hypertrophy. So it's like, if you want to see like a potentially appropriate way to program deadlifts, I definitely don't agree with everything AJ Morris does in terms of programming. He's a great coach by all means, 100%, but the way he programs deadlifts might be a pretty good way. He's achieved some pretty good results through that, but it's important to note that it is definitely anecdotal sort of evidence. But if I was going to look at an appropriate way to program it, that may be a decent approach.
Yeah. No. Perfectly summed up right there, James. And also, would you still you were saying that you don't obviously program all, the big three movements. You're not a huge fan of them in terms of, hypertrophy because they stimulate a lot of fatigue, which they do, 100% agree. However, just on a side note, if someone's got a very busy schedule, they can only do maybe 2-3 days full body, would you possibly say maybe due to getting in and out of the gym, those three movements would probably be a bit more practical for them, or you'd still probably steer away from it?
Well, I definitely wouldn't steer away from them in general, but I would say I would steer away from deadlifts if someone has the time to do it. But if someone's limited on time, that's where, like, so in terms of the squat and the bench press, I don't see those as any different from something like a hack squat and a dumbbell press. They're not in a different category for me. They're in the same category. Just as useful, just as stimulative, just depends on the individual. So there's like, if someone's limited on time, I would basically, for the most part, just do a lot of compounds, supersets, etc. Things like, you're not going to have them doing many bicep curls. Like, for the most part, you're going to get them in there, heavy rows, heavy bench presses, probably pretty close to failure, like 1 to 2 reps shy of failure. You're not really going to periodize that much if they only got 45 minutes 3 times a week. Like, you're just going to get them in there, trying to do similar exercises week in, week out, as hard as they can. You're not necessarily aiming to generate enough fatigue as possible. You're trying to get them to do as many, get as much volume in that is stimulative as possible. And then you have to think like, okay, I don't even think for that kind of client I would program in something like deadlifts, because if you want them to go and do deadlifts, there might be a lot of bang for your buck, but also if they do a set of deadlifts, how long are they fucked for afterwards? Like, how many minutes are they then sitting there trying to recover? Like, you might be looking at 5 minutes before they could attempt another set, either of deadlifts or something else, and make it relatively stimulative. So it's definitely, I would be careful programming there. However, my knowledge of in-person PT and the logistics of that are very limited.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense, man. And pretty much, obviously, on the topic of training and programming and exercise selection, just say someone's suddenly in a fat loss phase, they want to drop a few kilos, or they want to get, beach lean, jacked, basically. Would you say the training starts to change in terms of the volume, or would you not? Are you the one to not change volume until you actually see a plateau? Like, what's your approach on that?
So the main thing that I think people misunderstand about volume is it depends a lot on what you've done in the past. So it's like, let's say just a ballpark number. Someone's been doing 10 sets a week per muscle group for the last ever. They've been doing that forever. That then dictates what we can do in the future. Our goal with programming for hypertrophy is we want to generate a stimulus. A calorie deficit, which is like the only way to lose weight, it's a calorie deficit will basically lead to dietary fatigue. So that will lead to a lower ability to recover. So we're still going to essentially try and give someone the highest amount of stimulus. We're still going to try and do that, and it doesn't really change too much. And it really depends on the individual. Like, you might keep them training the exact same way they did, because other people might respond different to a calorie deficit relative to some people might respond different relative to others. Like, there's definitely better or worse ways to head into a calorie deficit, but you don't want to preemptively change training. You want to sort of go off some measures, like how fatigued do they feel? Is there certain niggles they're beginning to get? Is there other things that you can measure that can sort of demonstrate fatigue and sort of say how fatigued are they? Do they get 3 weeks into their mesocycle and they're thinking, wow, this is terrible. I'm regressing on lifts. I'm overshooting my RIR. I'm feeling terrible basically in every single lift. I don't feel as stimulative. I'm not getting a good pump. Like, yeah, that's something that I definitely want to learn more about in terms of like pump. I would like to learn more about applying pump as a useful sort of measure of biofeedback. That's something that I find is quite interesting. But in a surplus, that's already a thing that you need to be careful of, or something that I think is an interesting measure of what I guess we would call biofeedback. But it's basically just a measure that we can use to then auto-regulate training, which means just change it on the fly. But I definitely think it's something that I would like to learn more about. But yeah, I think I've forgotten what was your original question?
So it just pretty much like what it takes to get to that leanness stage, like the beach body, getting a client that wants to get really lean, just not for competition purposes, just more for like, recreational purposes. They're probably going away on a holiday or something like that. And it's just pretty much like, would you change up maybe some exercises in terms of, mitigating that fatigue? And also, would you be putting them on a regular deload schedule? So like every 4 weeks, they must deload.
Yeah. So it would definitely I wouldn't change it too much. However, like, for instance, it was again with my friend, Aaron Hoey, he from JPS, he's the strength student on Instagram. We were talking about his process of going into a comp prep, and he realized that, okay, what division was he competing in? I believe it was physique, or I believe it was basically, I think the case was he realized that he could maintain his legs relatively well on, I think it was like 1 to 2 sessions per week of legs, and then 4 to 5 of upper body. So it's like, it depends. Like, you want to maintain as much muscle as you can during a deficit, and you have to think, how can the individual do that? And it definitely depends on the individual, but you want to think, what's the maximum amount of volume that you can make them do? What's the minimum amount of volume you can make them do? And then you potentially work between the volume landmarks outlined by Mike Israetel. But I definitely think you don't have to work between the volume landmarks. Like, you don't have to do that every single mesocycle. You could, there's different methods of progression, and he doesn't necessarily know that it's in a calorie deficit. It's just basically the body it's more likely that it's like muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown kind of occur, like they both occur at the same time. We just want to increase the amount that muscle protein synthesis will occur, and we can do that through a variety of ways. It's just breakdown's going to be higher. How can we provide the biggest stimulus at the time? So then, as we increase diet fatigue, we're likely going to be able to have a lower ability to recover. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. But then also exercise performance may go down a tad, although it doesn't necessarily have to, but it really depends. I'm just going to turn on a light. 1 second.
No, all good, man. There you go. Nice and bright. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, man. Yeah, like whenever I've dieted, I've kind of stuck to the same volume. I've been usually all right, and I've kind of done it in a sense where I've ramped up the sets on my main compound movements, and then obviously the isolation movements go up a tad, and then I think that there was a program I was following. There was no deload. However, there was 2 blocks of training. So I think the second block, it kind of resets onto RPE. So it goes, so the last week's all 9s. And then basically the fatigue goes back to 7, and obviously the rep range changes. And then it's like a more higher rep range block where there's no more benching, there's no more, there's still squatting in there, but more higher reps. And the RPE goes up eventually once again until it hits the threshold. So would that be like a similar programming approach you'd probably use on your clients if they're in a calorie deficit, or ramping up the sets?
Yeah, I wouldn't I wouldn't inherently change anything until we need to. Like
okay.
If we change volume, like and again, I'm mentioning Aaron's name again. Aaron made a great meme. Yeah, he's a cool dude. He knows a lot about hypertrophy. There's a sort of a meme he made where it was like inexperienced coach as like the coffee jug, and then, or I think it was milk or something. And then there's like a coffee cup being filled with milk, and it's like volume is the milk going in, and it's like it's overflowing basically, and it's like inexperienced coach just pouring too much milk in the coffee, and it's like, so then it's overflowing. And inherently that's what we want to be careful with when adjusting volume. It's like, how much volume do you need? How much is a maintenance volume? That changes over time.
Yeah.
And it's like it's kind of one of the things later down the line that I think people like to think once they learn about the concept of volume, they then try and apply it really instantly. But it's like, you got to be careful how you modify volume, because it's like every unit of volume comes with a unit of fatigue. So it's like, with every unit of volume you add, do you want to add that fatigue? Is that worth it? Will that still achieve more stimulus? Like there's diminishing returns as you add volume. So yeah, I like, for instance, all my clients so far, I've only been coaching for 6 months now. When someone has transitioned into a deficit, I haven't changed anything programming wise deliberately. It's like I'm only really changing it based on how fatigued they feel. Same as I would in a bulk though. Like, it wouldn't inherently change anything. However, some coaches may do that differently. But yeah, I don't see the need to inherently just like preemptively change anything. You're more looking at once you start to see fatigue sort of come into the picture, because the stimulus is still going to be pretty similar. But you're going to see they're most likely going to be able to handle less, but that doesn't mean you should necessarily do less to begin with. Or they're just not going to perform as well, and their performances may start to regress, which is okay as well.
Yeah. No, definitely hit the nail on the head there, man. And pretty much lastly, all about training in general. Like, what would you say are the best habits in coaching online athletes, and how do you stay pretty much in like an in-demand coach, but obviously yourself, you follow an evidence-based approach. How would you apply a coaching service that's reputable and obviously results driven in a sustainable fashion?
So how, like, do you mean as a coach, like how would I go about, or how do I go about sort of making a coaching service that is sort of reputable?
Yeah.
And yeah, so
exactly.
For me personally, it's like I've taken a lot from my sort of mentors. Like, I've tried to, as a podcast host myself, I've developed quite a large group of people that I know I can rely on to give me advice and sort of guide me in a way and make sure I'm doing things relatively correctly. But it's very easy as a coach to think that you know everything. And like, I'm 21.
Wow.
I don't know. I don't know. Cut out there. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot that
I think I heard 21.
Yeah, 21. Yeah.
Jeez.
I'm young as I'm. Yeah.
Yeah.
I am very young. So it's like, for me to think that I know everything would be extremely not correct. So it's like, you need, and especially the younger coaches I see doing this, it's like they start to think that they're on top of the world, and you have to like realize how little you know. Like one person that I like to listen to basically make me realize how little I know in terms of programming knowledge is Brian Miner. Like he knows a crazy amount around programming knowledge, and he makes the way I talk about programming seem like it's childish gibberish. Like it's, and you have to find those people and make them challenge your beliefs. Like you don't have to talk to them personally because these people are busy people. Like someone like Eric Helms, for instance, like he's one of the most popular people in the evidence-based fitness industry. He's incredibly busy, and it's like, okay, maybe you cannot talk to these people directly. Maybe that's very difficult to do, and they are very, very busy. But it's like, how can you basically question your own beliefs, basically realize how little you know? It's like, if you're not evolving like all the time as a coach, that's one thing. Another thing is like make sure you're like doing an ethical practice. Like make sure you're being as ethical as possible. Like you have to be responsible as a coach. Like I realized the moment I started coaching, it's like I can't be a child anymore. You have to realize like you're looking after these people for a considerable amount, a considerable portion or percentage of their life is dictated by what you do for them. So it's like you need to know your shit. And then it's like you really need to know what you're talking about, but then also continue to learn. Like, don't just think you can learn it all once and then it's done. Like, this stuff does evolve, and we come up with new methods and new theories and all that, and you have to continually challenge your beliefs. And it's like you have to also realize, like, what are you doing that is inadequate as a coach? It's like basically question absolutely everything you do, and don't become overconfident. And allow the thing that I really, really like as a coach is like make sure your clients know that they can question you. Like many of my clients, or they'll ask me 2 to 3 questions at the end of their check-in. So we do like a video check-in every week, and they just send me a video of themselves talking about their week, and then I send one back, and then blah blah, and they'll ask me like 2 to 3 questions, like quite in-depth questions, whether like doesn't matter what it's about, and I'll see how to the degree to which I can answer it. But then if I cannot answer those questions, like one, that shows them I am infallible. Like it shows them I do not know everything, but I have to say when I don't know everything. And you have to make it aware to your clients that you don't know everything. And then you can say, here's a better resource to go to. Like you have to be a conversation I had with Eric Helms is along the lines of like, as a coach, how do you screen for things like body image disorders? What do you do when you get a client with a body image disorder? It's a very it's something you need to be very, very careful of. And I I still think there's areas that I can improve in terms of things like that, but you just need to realize that you don't know everything, realize that you're going to make mistakes, and but like be okay because you realize like you're still getting these people results, but like you have to improve continually. Like compare yourself to the best person in the industry. Why can you not be at their level? Like what is between you and them? What kind of knowledge? And if you think you're at the same level as them, you are likely wrong. Like I don't know, except the people that are in the same league as like I use Eric as an example because we're friends and blah blah blah. Like he's a very good example. He is probably like if you hired him as a coach, I don't think he actually does coaching very often anymore. But if you hired him as a coach, the degree of knowledge that you're getting is ridiculous. Like he's crazy. Like he knows so much. And it's like for you as a coach to think that you know as much as him is ridiculous. Or Mike or Jacob Skepis or Steve Hall. It's like these people, they know their shit to such a massive degree. Those are like some of the best coaches that I know. Or like I could name a billion names, but it's like if you think you know as much as these people, ridiculous. Or Mike or Jacob Skepis or Steve Hall. It's like these people, they know their shit to such a massive degree. Those are like some of the best coaches that I know. Or like I could name a billion names.
On the last point, where can we find you on social media? So just on Instagram or
So if you're looking to find me, I'm probably most well known for my podcast. So I've done 160 episodes. It's called the Hypertrophy Hub podcast. So it's just focused on hypertrophy for the most part. There's also some episodes touching on things like diabetes and health.
Yeah.
That's probably the most prominent way. My coaching is all done through my company called The Hypertrophy Hub. You can find that on Instagram. You could probably just search Hypertrophy Hub, or you can search James_Walsham. That's my normal sort of Instagram. I'm a lot less on the Hypertrophy Hub one, I'm very formal and I just put out information. On the James Walsham one, I take the piss a little bit more, and I basically say I speak my mind a lot more, but I'm trying to do that a little less just to be a bit more professional. But yeah, that's about where you can find me.
As always, James, and nice meeting you. And yeah, guys, feel free to stalk James's Instagram platforms, because it sounds like you got a lot of great content to follow. So no, that's great. Good. Thanks. Nice meeting you, man, and thanks for being on the podcast.
Pleasure.
Nice. Cheers, man. Speak to you soon. We are.